Here's a question we don't ask often enough. What if one of the worst things that can happen to a society is also the very thing that breaks it open and forces it to change? I'm not talking about a war or a revolution started by people. I'm talking about a pandemic, a silent microscopic event that killed perhaps half of a continent in just a few years. The Black Death. For centuries, we've focused on the horror of it, the bodies in the streets, the overwhelming scale of the loss. And that horror is real, and it's the starting point. But what if we've been missing the rest of the story? What if buried beneath the staggering death toll is a more complex, more challenging, and frankly, more uncomfortable narrative? One that isn't just about medieval Europe, but about how societies fundamentally work, how they fracture, and what emerges from the rubble. Stick with me, because today we're not just looking at what the Black Death was. We're pulling apart what it did, and I'm going to explain why I think its shadow is longer and stranger than you've ever been told. Before we begin, this video is an educational and analytical discussion of a major historical pandemic. It reflects analysis and opinion based on publicly available information and academic research. I am not offering medical or investment advice here. Our goal is to understand a pivotal moment in history, to think critically about cause and effect, and to see the complex, often unintended consequences of a world-altering event. So, let's establish the baseline. In the middle of the 14th century, a pathogen swept through Europe, North Africa, and Asia. We know it today as the plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. This wasn't a new germ, but this particular outbreak was catastrophic. It moved with terrifying speed. How did it spread? The classic and still primary explanation involves a chain of events that feels almost fateful. Fleas living on rodents, primarily black rats, get infected. Those fleas bite humans, passing on the bacteria. And because medieval life, especially in bustling port cities and trade hubs, was intimate with rodents, the conditions were perfect. But the story of its arrival reads like a geopolitical thriller. The prevailing narrative, supported by contemporary accounts and historians, points to the siege of the Genoese trading port of Kaffa in the Crimea in 1347. The besieging Mongol army, reportedly stricken by the disease, is said to have catapulted plague-ridden corpses over the city walls, an early gruesome act of biological warfare. Genoese merchants fled the city by ship, carrying the plague with them to Sicily, and from there it exploded across the Mediterranean and into Europe. Now the disease itself manifested in horrifying ways. The most common form was bubonic plague. Victims suffered sudden high fever, chills, weakness, and most infamously, painful swollen lymph nodes called buboes in the groin, armpit, or neck, which could grow to the size of an egg and turn black. But it could also become septicemic, poisoning the bloodstream and causing tissue to blacken and die, a possible origin for the name Black Death. Worst of all was the pneumonic form, which infected the lungs, could be spread through the air by coughs, and was almost always fatal. The scale of mortality is where the numbers become almost incomprehensible. For a long time, textbooks settled on an estimate that about 1/3 of Europe died. But more recent research digging into manorial records and skeletal evidence suggests the reality was even more severe. Some historians now argue the population of Western Europe may have been halved. Let that sink in. Imagine every other person you know gone within a handful of years. In England, analysis points to a drop from around 4.8 million to 2.6 million from 1348 to 1351, a loss of nearly 50%. It was, by any measure, one of the most profound demographic catastrophes in human history. This is where we move past the basic facts and into the analysis. Because the death toll, as staggering as it is just the opening act. The real story is what happens next. A society doesn't lose half its people and just carry on. Every single pillar of that medieval world was stressed, cracked, and in many cases shattered. And from that destruction came pressures that, in my view, fundamentally redirected the course of Western history. Let's start with the most immediate and tangible shock, the economy. Medieval Europe before the plague operated on a feudal system. It was a pyramid. At the bottom were the serfs, peasants bound to the land, providing labor to the lords above them in exchange for protection and the right to work a small plot for themselves. It was a system built on a specific balance, a large pool of cheap, tied labor. The plague completely inverted that logic. Suddenly, labor was the rarest, most valuable commodity in existence. Crops were rotting in fields with no one to harvest them. There were more workshops, tools, land, and houses than there were people to use them. And this is a crucial point. The plague killed people, but it didn't kill capital. It didn't destroy the land, the tools, the livestock, or the infrastructure. So what you had overnight was a situation where the per capita share of everything for the survivors suddenly doubled. Think about the incentive shift this created. A serf who once had no leverage could now look at his lord and make demands. Why work your lord's field for nothing when the farm next door is empty and its former owner is dead? Lords were desperate. To keep workers on their land, they had to offer things that were previously unthinkable: actual wages in cash, and not just subsistence wages, but competitive ones. Historical economic data shows a sharp and sustained rise in real wages across Europe in the decades after the plague. For the first time, a common laborer could afford more than just basic survival. They could buy better food, better clothing, even small luxuries. This wasn't just an economic adjustment. It was a psychological and social earthquake. The entire justification of the feudal order that the Lord provided safety in return for labor was crumbling because the bargaining power had catastrophically shifted, and the upper classes hated this. We have records of laws passed, like the English Statute of Labourers in 1351, that tried to cap wages and force people back into their old roles. But these laws were notoriously difficult to enforce because the economic pressure was so immense. This friction directly fueled waves of peasant revolts across Europe in the late 14th century, like the famous Peasants' Revolt in England in 1381. The genie of social mobility, once let out of the bottle, could not be put back in. This leads me to my next point, which is a more speculative but fascinating area of analysis: the possibility of a biological selection. This is where the research gets really interesting. Some scientists and anthropologists have asked, did the plague select for certain traits? Was survival random? Or did having a more robust constitution, a better immune system, or better prior health make you more likely to live? Pioneering work by anthropologists like Sharon DeWitt, who analyzed skeletal remains from plague cemeteries compared to non-plague graves, suggests the plague did not kill randomly. Her research indicates that older individuals and those showing skeletal signs of prior poor health or malnutrition, what she terms frailty, were at significantly higher risk of dying from the plague. If that's true, the implication is profound. The Black Death may have acted as a brutal, continent-wide force of natural selection, removing the most vulnerable from the gene pool on a scale never seen before or since. DeVita's later work even suggests that post-plague populations showed signs of better overall health and lived longer. Now, we have to be careful here. This is a complex and debated field. Linking this directly to modern genetic traits like the CCR5D32 allele that provides resistance to HIV is tenuous and disputed. But at a broad demographic level, the hypothesis is compelling. The pandemic didn't just change who owned what. It may have changed the biological resilience of the surviving European population itself. Let's address the giant, uncomfortable question lurking over all of this. A line of thought articulated by historians like James Bellish at Oxford asks, could the Black Death, in some terrible paradoxical way, have been good for Europe's long-term development? The Black Death broke the feudal lock on society. It accelerated a shift from subsistence farming to more profitable pastoralism, from corn to horn. It increased urbanization as survivors flocked to towns. The labor shortage incentivized labor-saving technology and innovation. More use of water mills, a shift from oared galleys to sailing ships that required smaller crews, and importantly, a greater investment in technologies like cannon and handguns, which required less training than a longbow. The Black Death even spurred European expansion. With a smaller population at home, why would Europe start exploring the world? Beylick's argument is that the plague created an expansion kit. It created a class of mobile, available labor, soldiers and sailors from impoverished regions, crew regions like parts of Scotland, Brittany, and Portugal, who were inured to risk. It increased demand for luxury goods, spices, silks, and new resources, and it provided the technologies, improved ships, guns, to project power far from home with relatively small numbers of people. In this view, the age of exploration that began at the end of the 15th century wasn't despite the plague, but was, in part, a long-term consequence of it. But, and this is a massive but, we have to push back hard against any sanitized progressive reading of this tragedy. To call the plague good is a gross historical misstep. It mistakes outcome for intent. It confuses adaptation with progress. The survivors rebuilt, and in rebuilding, they changed things. But to imply there was a silver lining is to minimize the sheer, unfathomable human suffering, the grief, the trauma, the communities erased. Furthermore, this expansion kit was later used to enable colonialism, the slave trade, and immense suffering for other peoples around the globe. Connecting the plague directly to these later horrors is a complex causal chain, but it's one we cannot ignore. The more accurate, and in my view, more powerful way to see it is as a massive system-wide reset. The old equilibrium was destroyed. The plague created a volatile, high-pressure environment where old rules failed and new possibilities, both empowering and terrifying, suddenly existed. Whether those possibilities led to better lives, more oppression, innovation, or violence depended on the human choices made in the centuries that followed. The shockwaves didn't stop at economics or demography. They radiated out and shook the very foundations of medieval consciousness. Medieval society was deeply religious, with the Catholic Church acting as the ultimate spiritual and often temporal authority. The Church had explanations for everything. Prosperity was a blessing, misfortune was a test or punishment for sin. But what explanation could possibly account for this? Why did praying priests die alongside sinful peasants? Why did devout communities get wiped out while some profane ones survived? The institution's failure to protect or explain the catastrophe shattered its credibility. We see this in the rise of extremist movements like the Flagellants, who believed they could atone for humanity's sins through public self-punishment, often bypassing and challenging church authority. We also see it in the horrific scapegoating and persecution of minority groups, particularly Jewish communities who were absurdly blamed for poisoning wells. When an event is this inexplicable within the existing worldview, people either reject the worldview or they find a malignant human agent to blame. Tragically, they often chose the latter. This crisis also hit the medical establishment. Traditional medicine, based on ancient Greek and Roman texts and theories of humors, was completely useless. Doctors died at high rates trying their standard cures. This failure created an opening. There was a slow, pragmatic turn towards empirical observation, anatomy, and surgery, moving away from pure book learning. It's not a coincidence that the Renaissance, with its human-centric focus on observation and understanding the natural world, gathered momentum in the centuries after the plague. The old answers had failed. People were forced to look for new ones. The Black Death demonstrates that a pandemic is not just a biological event. It is a social and psychological stress test. It doesn't create new social forces out of thin air. It takes the existing tensions, inequities, and flaws in a system and supercharges them. It accelerates history. It makes the hidden contradictions in a society impossible to ignore. In medieval Europe, it amplified the tension between labor and lordship, between faith and observable reality, between established authority and desperate experimentation. The Black Death wasn't just a tragedy that happened to Europe. It was an event that Europe happened through. Its legacy is not a single lesson, but a matrix of intertwined consequences: economic, social, biological, and cultural. When I look at the long arc from the 14th to the 17th century, from the plague to the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Age of Exploration, I see the fingerprints of this catastrophe everywhere. It didn't determine the exact path, but it cleared the thick forest of medieval stasis and made new paths conceivable. It created a world of both terrifying vacancy and unprecedented opportunity. This raises a final, crucial point about our relationship with history. We often study pandemics in isolation: the plague, the 1918 flu, and COVID-19. And while direct comparisons can be simplistic and risky, the Black Death offers a masterclass in second and third order effects. It reminds us that the primary crisis is only the beginning. The real story is in the adaptation, the recalibration, and the often unintended new worlds that are built in the aftermath. The world that emerged from the Black Death was more volatile, more mobile, more skeptical, more economically fluid, and more technologically driven than the one that entered it. Whether that constitutes progress is a value judgment for you to make, but that it constitutes a profound and irreversible transformation seems to me beyond doubt. The Black Death forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about resilience, fragility, and change. It shows that from the deepest collapse, new structures can arise, but they are built on a foundation of immense loss. That perhaps is the most enduring and complicated legacy of all. If you found this deep dive into the causes and world-altering consequences of the Black Death insightful, I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit the like button. It helps more people find analytical content like this. If you're not already, consider subscribing and tapping the notification bell so you don't miss the next analysis. I'm curious to hear your perspective in the comments. How do you weigh the transformative outcomes against the sheer human cost? Let's have a respectful discussion below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.